The morning sun cast long shadows across the Afghan mountains as Petty Officer First Class Maria Santos checked her medical kit one final time. Her calloused hands moved with practiced precision, counting bandages, checking IV bags, and ensuring every piece of equipment was secure. The weight of responsibility never left her shoulders, especially not here in the remote outpost of Forward Operating Base Bravo. Maria had been with SEAL Team 7 for 18 months, longer than most medics lasted in the field. Her teammates respected her skills, but there was something about her they couldn't quite understand. While other medics grew visibly tense during firefights, Maria remained unnaturally calm. When wounded soldiers screamed in pain, she worked with a steady focus that seemed almost mechanical. Some called it ice-cold professionalism. Others whispered that she was simply built different. The truth was something Maria had never shared with anyone in her unit. Behind her quiet efficiency lay a past that would have shocked her fellow SEALs, a history that explained why the sound of gunfire didn't make her flinch, and why the sight of blood never made her hands shake. Lieutenant Commander Jake Mitchell walked into the medical tent, his boots crunching on the gravel floor. Maria looked up from her inventory, offering a brief nod of acknowledgement. Mitchell had been her commanding officer since she joined the team, and while he trusted her abilities completely, he often found himself curious about the woman behind the uniform. "Santos, we've got intel on a possible Taliban stronghold about 15 clicks northeast," Mitchell said, unfolding a map on the small table between them. "The mission brief is at 1400 hours. I need you ready for anything." Maria studied the map, her dark eyes tracing the terrain features and potential evacuation routes. This was her routine before every mission, mentally preparing for the worst-case scenarios, calculating how she would move wounded soldiers through hostile territory, planning for equipment failures and supply shortages. "How many personnel?" she asked, her voice steady and professional. 12-man insertion. Intelligence suggests we might encounter heavy resistance." Mitchell paused, watching her reaction. Most medics would show at least some concern at this news. Maria simply nodded and returned to her equipment check. The other members of the team began filtering into the briefing area. Petty Officer Second Class Tommy Rodriguez, the team's explosives expert, dropped his gear bag near Maria's station. He had been trying to figure out Maria since day one. She was competent, reliable, and completely unreadable. "Hey Doc, you ever get nervous before these ops?" Rodriguez asked, settling onto a wooden crate beside her medical supplies. Maria looked up, considering the question. Nervous wasn't the right word for what she felt. Prepared, focused, alert. These were more accurate descriptions. But nervous implied fear, and fear was something she had learned to control long before she ever joined the Navy. "Fear keeps you alive, if you use it right," she replied, checking the expiration date on a morphine syrette. "Panic gets people killed." Rodriguez nodded, though he suspected there was more to her answer than she was letting on. Everyone in the unit had their theories about Maria Santos. Some thought she came from a military family, raised on discipline and structure. Others figured she had previous combat experience, maybe with the Marines before transferring to the Navy. A few believed she was naturally gifted at handling stress. None of them had guessed the truth. Staff Sergeant Ben Parker, the team's communications specialist, joined the conversation. Parker had served 3 tours in Afghanistan and prided himself on reading people. Maria Santos was a puzzle he couldn't solve. "Santos, where'd you grow up?" Parker asked, attempting to sound casual. "You've got this way of handling chaos that doesn't come from textbooks." Maria's hands paused for just a moment before continuing their methodical inspection of her trauma kit. The question was innocent enough, but it touched on memories she preferred to keep buried. Growing up in East Los Angeles hadn't been about textbooks or military training. It had been about survival in a different kind of war zone. "California," she answered simply, offering no additional details. The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Chief Petty Officer David Knox, the team's senior enlisted leader. Knox commanded respect through experience and competence, and he had been watching Maria's performance since her arrival. Unlike the others, he wasn't curious about her background. He cared only about results, and Maria Santos delivered results. "Gear up, people. Brief starts in 30 minutes, Knox announced. "Santos, I want you carrying extra blood products for this one. Intel suggests we might be dealing with IEDs." Maria nodded, already calculating the additional weight and adjusting her load distribution accordingly. IEDs meant potential blast injuries, massive trauma, and the kind of wounds that required immediate surgical intervention. She had seen it all before, both in military hospitals and in places her teammates would never imagine. As the team prepared for the mission briefing, Maria found herself thinking about the path that had brought her to this moment. The decision to join the Navy had been about escape as much as service. The decision to become a medic had been about redemption. But the ability to remain calm under fire, to think clearly when others panicked, to save lives when death seemed certain, those skills hadn't come from military training. They had come from a childhood spent dodging bullets on city streets, from teenage years working in underground medical clinics, from a past that had forged her into something harder than steel but more flexible than wire. Her teammates saw only the end result, a medic who never cracked under pressure. They had no idea about the pressure that had created her. The mission ahead would test all of them. In the mountains of Afghanistan, with Taliban fighters potentially waiting in ambush, every decision could mean the difference between life and death. For Maria Santos, it was just another day at the office, another chance to use skills learned in the hardest school imaginable. What her teammates didn't know was that before she ever wore a Navy uniform, before she ever treated a wounded soldier, Maria had been saving lives in places where heroes never got recognition, and survival meant staying invisible. The story of how a girl from the streets of Los Angeles became one of the most effective combat medics in the SEALs was one that would have changed everything. Her teammates thought they knew about her, but that story would have to wait. Right now, there was a mission to complete and lives to protect. The truth about Maria Santos would remain her secret, at least for now. The helicopter lifted off at Oro 300 hours, its rotors cutting through the cold mountain air as SEAL Team 7 headed toward their target. Maria sat between Rodriguez and Parker, her medical pack secured tightly against her chest. The familiar weight of the equipment was comforting, each piece carefully chosen and positioned for maximum efficiency. Through her night vision goggles, the Afghan landscape looked like an alien world painted in green and black. Rocky peaks stretched endlessly in all directions, hiding valleys where enemy fighters could wait for hours or days. This terrain had swallowed entire armies throughout history, and it demanded respect from anyone brave enough to enter it. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell's voice crackled through their headsets. Reviewing the mission parameters one final time, intelligence indicated a high-value target was using a compound in the mountains as a meeting place. The team's job was to capture or eliminate the target and gather any intelligence materials before disappearing back into the night. Maria listened while conducting her pre-mission ritual, mentally rehearsing trauma procedures and evacuation protocols. She visualized different scenarios: gunshot wounds to various body regions, blast injuries from improvised explosive devices, burns from incendiary weapons. For each type of injury, she reviewed the appropriate treatment sequence, medication dosages, and stabilization techniques. This mental preparation had become second nature, but it hadn't started in the military. Years before she ever heard of SEAL teams, a 14-year-old Maria had been forced to learn these same procedures in the back rooms of illegal clinics and abandoned buildings. The weapons were different then, but the wounds were often just as severe. The helicopter began its descent toward the landing zone, a narrow valley about 2 kilometers from the target compound. Maria felt the familiar tightening in her stomach that came before every insertion. Not from fear, but from anticipation. Her body was preparing for combat, releasing adrenaline and sharpening her senses. 2 minutes out, the pilot announced through their headsets. Around her, the team went through their final checks. Weapons were chambered, communication devices tested, and equipment secured. Maria verified that her trauma kit was easily accessible and that her secondary medical supplies were properly distributed among the other team members. Chief Knox caught her eye and gave a slight nod. It was his way of asking if she was ready, and Maria's answering nod confirmed that she was. Knox had seen enough combat medics to recognize the difference between confidence and bravado. Maria Santos possessed the real thing, a quiet certainty that came from experience rather than training. The helicopter touched down in a cloud of dust and debris. Within seconds, the team was on the ground and moving toward their objective. Maria fell into position in the middle of the formation, where she could quickly reach any team member who might need medical attention. The trek to the compound took 45 minutes across rough terrain. They moved silently, Communicating through hand signals and night vision equipment, Maria's breathing remained steady despite the elevation and the weight of her gear. Her cardiovascular conditioning was excellent, but more importantly, she had learned long ago how to control her body's responses to stress. When she was 16, running from gang members through the alleys of East LA, Maria had discovered that panic consumed oxygen and energy that could mean the difference between escape and capture. That lesson had served her well during Navy training and continued to serve her now in the mountains of Afghanistan. The compound appeared ahead of them, a cluster of mud brick buildings surrounded by a low wall. Intelligence reports indicated at least 6 enemy fighters inside, possibly more. The team took position around the perimeter, waiting for Mitchell's signal to begin the assault. Maria found cover behind a large boulder that offered protection, while maintaining visual contact with the entire team. Her position allowed her to observe all approaches to the compound and provided multiple routes for reaching wounded personnel. These tactical considerations had become instinctive, developed through years of treating patients in hostile environments where safety was never guaranteed. The assault began with coordinated breaches at 2 entry points. Rodriguez used shaped charges to blow open the main gate, while Parker's team entered through a side entrance. The sound of explosions echoed off the mountain walls, followed immediately by automatic weapons fire. Maria watched through her scope as the team moved through the compound with practiced efficiency. Each SEAL knew his role and executed it with precision. Within minutes, they had secured the main building and were systematically clearing the remaining structures. Then she heard Knox's voice through her headset. "Santos, we've got a wounded civilian inside. Female gunshot wound to the abdomen. I need you in here now." Maria grabbed her trauma kit and sprinted toward the compound, her mind already shifting into medical mode. Civilian casualties complicated everything, both tactically and morally. The rules of engagement required them to provide medical care regardless of the person's affiliation. But treating patients in active combat zones presented unique challenges. She entered the main building to find Knox kneeling beside a young Afghan woman who couldn't have been more than 20 years old. Blood was spreading across her traditional dress and her breathing was rapid and shallow. Maria immediately recognized the signs of hemorrhagic shock. "How long ago was she hit?" Maria asked, dropping to her knees beside the patient. "Unknown. We found her like this when we cleared the room," Knox replied. "Could have been minutes or hours." Maria began her assessment, checking pulse, blood pressure, and respiratory rate while simultaneously examining the wound. The bullet had entered just below the ribcage on the left side, likely damaging internal organs. Without immediate surgical intervention, the woman would die within the hour. But this wasn't a hospital, and Maria wasn't a surgeon. She was a combat medic working in a hostile environment, with limited resources and no backup. The situation required her to make decisions that most people would find impossible, to remain calm while a young woman's life hung in the balance. As she worked to stabilize the patient, inserting an IV line and administering pain medication, Maria found herself remembering another young woman, another gunshot wound, another impossible situation. The memory was from years earlier in a different country, but the desperation in the patient's eyes was exactly the same. The woman on the floor began speaking rapidly in Pashto, her voice weak but urgent. Maria didn't understand the words, but she recognized the tone. The woman was asking for help, pleading for her life in the only way she could. "Tell her we're going to help her," Maria said to the team's interpreter, who had remained outside during the assault. "Tell her to stay calm and keep breathing." As the interpreter translated, Maria continued working to control the bleeding and prepare the woman for evacuation. Every technique she used had been learned through necessity rather than choice, developed in places where formal medical training was a luxury and survival was an art form. The sound of approaching helicopters told Maria that their extraction was imminent. She had perhaps 10 minutes to stabilize the patient enough for transport, 10 minutes to save a life using skills that her teammates still didn't fully understand. Maria worked with surgical precision, her hands moving independently of conscious thought as she fought to save the Afghan woman's life. The wound was worse than she had initially assessed. The bullet had likely nicked the spleen and possibly damaged the left kidney. Internal bleeding was severe, and without immediate surgical intervention, the patient would not survive the helicopter flight back to base. "Santos, we need to move in 3 minutes," Mitchell's voice came through her headset. Hostile forces are converging on our position from the north. Maria didn't acknowledge the transmission. Her entire focus was on the woman beneath her hands, whose pulse was growing weaker by the minute. She had seen this scenario countless times before, though never in a military context. The setting was different, but the life and death urgency was achingly familiar. Working quickly, she packed the wound with hemostatic gauze, applying direct pressure to slow the bleeding while simultaneously establishing a second IV line. The woman's blood pressure was dropping dangerously low, and Maria began pushing fluids to maintain circulation. Every movement was calculated, efficient, learned through years of practice in situations where there was no room for error. Knox appeared beside her, his expression tense. "Doc, we've got company coming. Taliban forces, maybe a dozen fighters heading straight for us." 2 more minutes, Maria replied without looking up from her patient. She was threading a nasogastric tube to decompress the woman's stomach, a procedure that would reduce pressure on the damaged organs and make transport safer. "We don't have 2 minutes, Knox said firmly. "The evac bird is inbound, but we need to be at the landing zone in 60 seconds or we're stuck here until dawn." Maria's hands never stopped moving. She had been in this position before, forced to make impossible choices about who lived and who died. The difference was that now she wore a uniform that came with rules and regulations about leaving no one behind. In her previous life, the rules had been much simpler: save who you can and don't look back. The sound of gunfire erupted from the north side of the compound. Rodriguez's voice crackled through the radio. "Multiple hostiles approaching fast. We need to move now." Maria looked down at the Afghan woman whose eyes were filled with pain and fear. In those dark eyes she saw an echo of her own past. Memories of nights when she had been the one bleeding, the one whose life depended on someone else's skill and compassion. "Chief, help me get her on the stretcher," Maria said, making her decision. "We're taking her with us." Knox hesitated for a moment. Military doctrine was clear about the risks of transporting unknown civilians, especially in hostile territory. But he had learned to trust Maria's judgment, and something in her voice told him this wasn't open for debate. Together, they lifted the woman onto a portable stretcher, while Maria continued to monitor her vital signs. The patient was conscious but weak, her breathing shallow and rapid. Maria adjusted the IV flow rate and checked the wound dressing, ensuring everything was secure for transport. The team moved quickly through the compound and toward the landing zone, with Maria running alongside the stretcher while maintaining pressure on the wound. The sound of rotor blades grew louder as their extraction helicopter approached, but so did the sound of pursuing enemy forces. "Hostile contact. 200 meters and closing," Parker reported from the rear guard position. Maria could hear the tension in her teammates' voices, but her own remained steady as she coordinated the patient's care during movement. This kind of multitasking under extreme pressure was something she had mastered long before joining the military, developed through necessity during years when medical emergencies never happened at convenient times or safe locations. The helicopter touched down in a whirlwind of dust and debris. Maria and Knox loaded the stretcher while the rest of the team provided covering fire. Bullets began impacting the ground around them as Taliban fighters reached effective range. But Maria's hands remained steady as she secured the patient for flight. Once airborne, she began advanced treatment procedures that were normally reserved for hospital settings. Using techniques that went far beyond standard combat medic training, Maria inserted a chest tube to address a pneumothorax that had developed during transport. Her movements were confident and precise as if she had performed this procedure hundreds of times before. Knox watched in amazement as Maria worked. He had seen many combat medics over the years, but none with this level of surgical skill. The procedures she was performing required training that typically took years to develop. Yet Maria couldn't have been in the Navy for more than a few years based on her rank. "Where did you learn to do that?" Knox asked, gesturing toward the chest tube insertion. Maria looked up briefly, her eyes meeting his for just a moment before returning to her patient. "You learn what you need to learn," she replied simply. It wasn't really an answer, but Knox recognized the tone. It was the same voice Maria used whenever anyone asked about her background or training. She deflected questions without being rude, provided just enough information to satisfy curiosity without revealing anything meaningful. The flight back to base took 30 minutes, during which Maria never stopped working. She administered blood products, monitored cardiac function, and adjusted medication dosages based on the patient's changing condition. Her teammates watched in silent respect as she essentially performed battlefield surgery at 8,000 feet. Lieutenant Commander Mitchell observed the medical care from his position near the cockpit. He had recommended Maria for several commendations based on her performance in the field, but watching her work now, he realized he had been underestimating her capabilities. This wasn't just competent medical care. This was the work of someone with extensive surgical experience. As they approached the base, Maria began preparing for the handoff to the trauma team. She organized her documentation, prepared verbal reports for the receiving physicians, and ensured that all her equipment was accounted for. Even in the midst of a life-and-death emergency, her organizational skills remained flawless. The helicopter landed on the medical helipad, where a full trauma team was waiting. Maria briefed the lead physician in rapid professional terms, providing a complete picture of the patient's condition and the treatment provided during transport. The doctors listened with obvious respect for her clinical assessment. As the patient was wheeled into the trauma bay, the lead surgeon stopped and looked back at Maria. "Excellent work, Petty Officer. Your interventions probably saved her life. Where did you complete your advanced trauma training?" Maria felt the familiar tightness in her chest that came whenever someone asked about her medical background. The truth was complicated, painful, and not something she was ready to share with anyone, so she gave the same answer she always gave. "Navy taught me everything I need to know, sir." The surgeon nodded, though his expression suggested he wasn't entirely convinced. Maria's skills went far beyond standard military training, but he didn't press the issue. In military medicine, results mattered more than credentials. As the medical team disappeared into the hospital, Maria found herself alone on the helipad with her equipment. The adrenaline was beginning to fade, leaving behind the familiar emptiness that followed every successful mission. She had saved a life tonight, but the victory felt hollow somehow. Her teammates were already heading toward debriefing, but Maria needed a moment to collect herself. The mission had triggered memories she preferred to keep buried, reminders of a time when saving lives had been about survival rather than service. A time when the line between patient and perpetrator had been much less clear. 3 days after the rescue mission, Maria sat in the base medical facility reviewing inventory reports when Dr. Sarah Chen, the trauma surgeon who had treated the Afghan woman, approached her workstation. Maria looked up from her paperwork, noting the serious expression on the doctor's face. "Petty Officer Santos, do you have a few minutes to talk?" Dr. Chen asked, settling into the chair across from Maria's desk. Maria nodded, though she felt the familiar defensive tension building in her shoulders. Conversations that started this way rarely went in directions she wanted to explore. "The patient you brought in 3 nights ago is stable now," Dr. Chen continued. "She's going to make a full recovery, largely because of the advanced care you provided during transport. I've been practicing trauma surgery for 12 years, and I've rarely seen field medicine at that level." "I'm glad she's doing well," Maria replied, keeping her voice neutral and professional. Dr. Chen leaned forward slightly, her expression curious rather than suspicious. "Maria, I've reviewed your military medical training records. Standard Navy Corpsman School, Advanced Combat Medical Training, Wilderness Medicine Certification. All excellent programs, but none of them teach the surgical procedures you performed on that helicopter." Maria felt her heart rate increase slightly, but her expression remained unchanged. This was the conversation she had been dreading since joining the Navy. The moment when someone with enough medical knowledge would recognize that her skills exceeded her official training. "The procedures worked," Maria said simply. "That's what matters." "Of course they worked," Dr. Chen agreed. "That's exactly my point. You performed a surgical chest tube insertion in a moving helicopter, under fire with limited equipment. You administered blood products using protocols that most paramedics don't know. Where did you learn those techniques?" Maria stood up, ostensibly to file her inventory reports, but really to create some physical distance. The truth was that she had learned those techniques in underground medical clinics in Los Angeles, treating gang members and undocumented immigrants who couldn't risk going to legitimate hospitals. She had performed her first chest tube insertion when she was 17, guided by a former military medic who ran a backroom clinic in exchange for protection money. "Experience teaches you a lot," Maria said, her back to Dr. Chen as she organized medical supplies that didn't need organizing. Dr. Chen was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice was gentler. Maria, I'm not trying to get you in trouble. I'm trying to understand how someone with your obvious surgical skills ended up as a combat medic instead of pursuing medical school. The question hit closer to home than Dr. Chen could have known. Medical school had been Maria's dream once, back when she still believed that legitimate paths were available to someone with her background. Before she learned that some doors remained permanently closed to people who came from certain neighborhoods, who had certain histories, who lacked certain connections. Not everyone gets the same opportunities, Maria replied, finally turning around to face Dr. Chen. That's exactly what I'm talking about, Dr. Chen said, leaning back in her chair. You have natural surgical instincts that can't be taught. Your hand-eye coordination is exceptional, your decision-making under pressure is flawless, and your anatomical knowledge is extensive.
Have you ever considered applying to medical school?
Maria almost laughed at the irony. Medical school applications required background checks, character references, and financial resources that had never been available to her. They also required explanations for gaps in education and employment that she couldn't provide without revealing a past that would disqualify her from any respectable profession. That ship has sailed, Maria said, returning to her desk. Dr. Chen studied her for a long moment, clearly sensing there was more to the story. Maria, I don't know what your background is, and I'm not going to pry, but I want you to know that if you ever decide to pursue advanced medical training, I would be happy to provide a recommendation. What you did for that patient was extraordinary. After Dr. Chen left, Maria sat alone in the medical facility, staring at her hands. These hands had saved the Afghan woman's life, but they had also done things she tried not to remember. They had treated gunshot wounds inflicted by people she knew, had performed surgery in abandoned buildings while lookouts watched for police, had learned to distinguish between savable and unsavable patients based on resource calculations rather than medical ethics. The irony wasn't lost on her that the same skills that made her valuable to the Navy had been developed in environments the Navy would never officially acknowledge. Her ability to remain calm under fire came from years of dodging bullets. Her surgical precision had been honed while working without proper equipment or sterilization. Her medical knowledge had been earned through necessity rather than education. That evening, Maria found herself in the base recreation area, where several of her teammates were playing poker. Rodriguez waved her over and she reluctantly joined the game. She wasn't particularly social, but isolation bred suspicion, and she had learned to maintain just enough camaraderie to blend in. Hey, Doc, heard you saved some civilian's life the other night, Rodriguez said, dealing cards around the table. Pretty impressive stuff according to the trauma team. Maria picked up her cards without comment, focusing on the game rather than the conversation. Parker looked up from his hand. Santos, you ever think about becoming a real doctor? I mean, you've got the skills for it. I'm already a real medic, Maria replied, discarding 2 cards and drawing replacements. You know what he means, Knox interjected from across the table. You could probably get into medical school with a recommendation from the Navy. Hell, they might even pay for it. Maria considered her response carefully. These men were her teammates, and she trusted them with her life. But trust in combat was different from personal trust. Combat trust was about competence and reliability. Personal trust required vulnerability she couldn't afford. I like what I do, she said finally. I'm good at it and it makes a difference. Mitchell, who had been quietly playing his hand, looked up at her. Santos, can I ask you something? And you can tell me to mind my own business if you want. Maria nodded, though every instinct told her to deflect whatever question was coming. How old were you when you first treated a gunshot wound? The question hung in the air like smoke from a fired weapon. Maria felt every eye at the table focused on her, waiting for an answer that would either satisfy their curiosity or deepen the mystery that surrounded her. The honest answer was 14. She had been walking home from school when she heard gunshots from an alley behind a liquor store. Instead of running like any sensible teenager, she had investigated and found a young man bleeding from a wound to his thigh. Using first aid techniques learned from a health class and instincts she didn't know she possessed, she had applied pressure to the wound and improvised a tourniquet from her belt. The man survived, and word spread through the neighborhood about the girl who could handle medical emergencies. It wasn't long before people started coming to her apartment when they needed medical help, but couldn't risk going to a hospital. Her mother, a nurse who had lost her license due to drug addiction, taught her advanced techniques in exchange for the money these underground patients provided. But Maria couldn't tell her teammates any of that. Instead, she gave them a version of the truth that they could accept. "Navy training starts early," she said, folding her hand and standing up from the table. "I'm going to get some sleep." As she walked away, Maria could feel their eyes following her. She knew they weren't satisfied with her answer, knew that their curiosity was growing rather than diminishing. Eventually, someone would dig deeper, ask harder questions, or simply piece together enough clues to uncover the truth about her past. When that day came, she would have to decide whether to trust them with the real story of how Maria Santos became the medic they relied on to save their lives. The attack came without warning during what should have been a routine patrol. SEAL Team 7 was conducting reconnaissance near a suspected weapons cache when an improvised explosive device detonated beneath their lead vehicle. The blast threw the armored truck 20 feet off the road and turned a quiet morning into a nightmare of smoke, fire, and screaming. Maria was thrown from her position in the rear vehicle, her medical pack flying in one direction while she tumbled in another. Her ears rang from the explosion, and dust filled her lungs as she struggled to orient herself. Training took over before conscious thought, and she began moving toward the destroyed vehicle where her teammates were trapped. Through the smoke and debris, she could see Rodriguez hanging upside down in his harness, blood streaming from a head wound. Parker was unconscious in the driver's seat, his left arm bent at an unnatural angle. Mitchell was trying to extract himself from the passenger side, but his legs appeared to be pinned beneath twisted metal. "Santos, report." Knox's voice came through her damaged headset, barely audible through the static. "Multiple casualties," Maria responded, already moving toward her scattered medical equipment. "I need immediate medevac and additional medical support." But even as she called for backup, Maria knew that help was at least 30 minutes away. In 30 minutes, Rodriguez could bleed to death from his head injury. In 30 minutes, Parker's internal injuries could prove fatal. In 30 minutes, Mitchell could go into shock from his trapped position. She had 30 minutes to keep 3 critically injured men alive, using whatever supplies she could salvage from the wreckage. This was the scenario every combat medic dreaded: multiple critical patients, limited resources, and no backup. It was also the scenario Maria had been preparing for her entire life, though not in the way her teammates might have expected. She reached Rodriguez first, climbing into the overturned vehicle through a shattered window. Glass cut through her uniform, but she ignored the pain as she assessed his condition. The head wound was severe but not immediately life-threatening. More concerning was the way his pupils responded to light, signs of a possible traumatic brain injury. Working quickly, she secured Rodriguez's airway and stabilized his neck before moving to Parker. The unconscious SEAL was breathing, but his pulse was weak and rapid. Maria suspected internal bleeding, possibly from a ruptured spleen or damaged liver. Without surgical intervention, he would die within the hour. Mitchell was conscious but in severe pain from his trapped legs. Maria could see that his right femur was fractured, possibly in multiple places. The bones could have severed the femoral artery, which would mean massive internal bleeding and death within minutes. "Doc, how bad is it?" Mitchell asked through gritted teeth. Maria looked at her commanding officer, seeing not just his physical injuries, but the weight of command in his eyes. He was asking for an honest assessment, not false reassurance. "Bad enough," she replied, beginning to work on his legs. "But manageable." It was a lie. The situation was far beyond manageable by any conventional standard. 3 critical patients requiring immediate surgery, limited medical supplies, and no hospital within reach. Any reasonable medic would have triaged the patients, focused on saving whoever had the best chance of survival, and accepted that not everyone would make it home. But Maria Santos had never been reasonable, and she had never accepted that some people couldn't be saved. Working with speed that bordered on supernatural, she began treating all 3 patients simultaneously. She inserted IV lines in Rodriguez and Parker, while applying a tourniquet to Mitchell's leg. She administered pain medication to Mitchell while monitoring Rodriguez's neurological status. She pushed blood products into Parker while calculating medication dosages for all 3 men. Her movements were precise, efficient, and completely focused. There was no wasted motion, no hesitation, no second-guessing. Every technique she employed had been learned through necessity, developed in situations where failure meant death and success meant the difference between someone's family, having a funeral, or a homecoming. Knox appeared at the vehicle, having fought his way through enemy fire to reach the crash site. He took one look at the scene and understood immediately that they were in trouble. 3 critical patients were more than any single medic could handle, especially under combat conditions. "What do you need?" Knox asked, sliding into the wreckage beside Maria. "Apply pressure here," Maria said, guiding Knox's hands to a pressure point on Rodriguez's neck. "Maintain it exactly like that until I tell you to stop." Knox followed her instructions without question, watching in amazement as Maria continued to work on all 3 patients. Her hands moved independently, one checking Parker's pulse while the other adjusted Mitchell's IV flow rate. It was like watching a surgeon who had grown additional limbs. "Santos, the bleeding isn't stopping," Knox reported, feeling Rodriguez's pulse growing weaker beneath his fingers. Maria looked up from her work on Mitchell's leg fracture, assessing Rodriguez's condition in a single glance. The head wound was worse than she had initially thought, and conventional treatment wasn't going to be sufficient. She needed to take risks that went far beyond standard combat medic protocols. Moving quickly, she began a procedure that Knox didn't recognize. Using instruments from her surgical kit, Maria made a precise incision near Rodriguez's hairline and began working inside the wound. Her movements were confident and sure, as if she had performed this exact procedure countless times before. "Doc, what are you doing?" Knox asked, his voice tight with concern. "Stopping the bleeding," Maria replied without looking up. "Keep that pressure steady." What she was actually doing was performing a field craniotomy, relieving pressure on Rodriguez's brain by creating a small opening in his skull. It was a neurosurgical procedure that required years of training and specialized equipment. Maria had neither, but she had something else. Experience gained in underground clinics where desperate situations demanded impossible solutions. The procedure worked. Rodriguez's vital signs stabilized and the dangerous swelling in his brain began to subside. Knox watched in stunned silence as Maria sealed the incision with surgical precision, her hands moving with the confidence of someone who had performed this operation many times before. "How did you know how to do that?" Knox asked quietly. Maria didn't answer. She was already moving to Parker, whose condition was deteriorating rapidly. His blood pressure was dropping, and his skin was taking on the gray pallor that indicated massive internal bleeding. Without immediate surgical intervention, he would be dead within minutes. Once again, Maria made a decision that went far beyond her official training. Using a combination of field surgery techniques and improvisations born from desperation, she began treating Parker's internal injuries while he remained unconscious in the overturned vehicle. Working by feel as much as sight, she located the source of the bleeding and controlled it using methods that would have shocked a team of emergency room physicians. Her hands moved inside Parker's abdominal cavity with the skill of a practiced surgeon, guided by anatomical knowledge that couldn't have come from military training alone. "Santos, medevac is still 20 minutes out," Knox reported, monitoring the radio while maintaining pressure on Rodriguez's wound. 20 minutes might as well have been 20 hours. Mitchell's condition was stable for now, but Rodriguez and Parker both needed immediate hospital care. The procedures Maria had performed were temporary measures at best, designed to keep them alive long enough to reach definitive medical treatment. But as she worked, Maria found herself remembering other patients, other impossible situations where 20 minutes had been an eternity. She remembered treating gunshot victims in abandoned warehouses while gang fights raged outside. She remembered performing emergency surgery on kitchen tables while police sirens wailed in the distance. She remembered learning that sometimes the difference between life and death was nothing more than refusing to give up. The sound of approaching helicopters told her that help was finally arriving. A full medical team would soon take over care of her patients, and she would be expected to provide detailed reports about the treatments she had administered. Those reports would raise questions about her techniques, her training, and her background. But for now, all that mattered was that Rodriguez's pupils were responding normally to light. Parker's blood pressure had stabilized and Mitchell was conscious and alert. 3 men who should have died in the Afghan mountains were going to see their families again. As the medevac team loaded her patients onto stretchers, the lead flight surgeon approached Maria with obvious questions in his eyes. Her uniform was covered in blood, her hands were shaking slightly from exhaustion, and her medical kit contained instruments that weren't standard issue for combat medics. "Petty Officer Santos, I need a full report on the procedures you performed," the surgeon said, his tone professional but curious. Maria looked at her teammates being loaded into the helicopter, then back at the surgeon. She knew that her reports would be analyzed, that questions would be asked, that her background would be investigated more thoroughly than ever before. "I did what was necessary to keep them alive," she said simply. The surgeon nodded, but his expression suggested that he would want much. The formal inquiry began 3 days after the IED attack. Maria sat across from a panel of Navy medical officers, psychiatrists, and intelligence personnel in a sterile conference room at the base hospital. Her teammates were recovering well. Rodriguez had been evacuated to Germany for specialized neurological care. Parker was stable but would need additional surgery, and Mitchell was already demanding to be released back to duty. Captain Rebecca Walsh, the senior medical officer conducting the inquiry, opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. Maria recognized copies of her military service record, medical training certifications, and performance evaluations. What she didn't recognize were several additional documents that hadn't been there before. "Petty Officer Santos, you understand this is a standard inquiry following any field medical incident involving unusual procedures," Captain Walsh began, her tone professional but not unfriendly. "Your actions saved 3 lives, and the Navy wants to understand how and why you were able to perform advanced surgical techniques under combat conditions." Maria nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the anxiety building in her chest. "According to witness statements, you performed what appears to be a field craniotomy on Petty Officer Rodriguez," Walsh continued, reading from a report. "This is a neurosurgical procedure typically performed only by specialists in hospital settings. Can you explain how you learned this technique?" The question Maria had been dreading was finally on the table. She had rehearsed various answers during the past 3 days, but none of them felt adequate. Half-truths and deflections had worked with her teammates, but they wouldn't satisfy a formal investigation. "Emergency situations require improvisation," Maria said carefully. "I use techniques adapted from my medical training to address the specific injuries I encountered." Commander James Harrison, the psychiatrist on the panel, leaned forward slightly. "Maria, your psychological evaluations have always been exemplary. You show remarkable stress tolerance and decision-making abilities under pressure, but the procedures you performed go beyond improvisation. They demonstrate surgical knowledge and experience that isn't reflected in your official training record." Maria felt the walls closing in around her. These people were professionals who understood medicine and human behavior. They wouldn't be satisfied with vague explanations or deflections. Captain Walsh opened another document, and Maria's heart rate spiked as she recognized what it was. A background investigation report that was much more detailed than anything she had seen before. "Maria, we've conducted an expanded background investigation as part of this inquiry," Walsh said gently. "We know about Los Angeles. We know about the clinics. We know about Dr. Elena Vasquez." The mention of Elena's name hit Maria like a physical blow. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been her mentor, teacher, and surrogate mother during the years when Maria had learned to save lives in the shadows of East LA. Elena had taught her surgery in abandoned buildings, had shown her how to treat trauma without proper equipment, had given her the skills that were now saving American soldiers' lives. Elena had also been killed 3 years ago, murdered by the same gang member she had spent her life trying to help. "We're not here to judge your past," Commander Harrison said, his voice gentle. "We're here to understand how your experiences shaped your abilities, and how those abilities can best serve the Navy and your teammates." Maria looked around the table at the faces watching her, seeing not the condemnation she had expected, but something that looked like compassion and professional curiosity. For the first time in years, she found herself considering the possibility of telling the truth. "Dr. Vasquez was a trauma surgeon," Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. "She lost her license after a malpractice lawsuit, but she kept practicing in underground clinics. She treated people who couldn't go to hospitals, undocumented immigrants, gang members, anyone who needed help but couldn't risk official medical care." Captain Walsh nodded encouragingly. "And she taught you?" "Starting when I was 14, Maria continued, the words coming easier now that she had started. "At first I just helped with basic care, holding pressure on wounds, organizing supplies, translating for patients who only spoke Spanish. But Elena saw that I had natural aptitude, and she started teaching me more advanced techniques. The memories flooded back as she spoke. Countless nights spent in makeshift operating rooms, learning anatomy from textbooks Elena had saved from medical school, practicing surgical procedures on cadavers obtained through connections Maria had never questioned. It had been an education in medicine that no university could have provided, brutal and comprehensive and entirely outside the bounds of conventional training. By the time I was 18, I was performing surgery, Maria continued. Gunshot wounds, stab wounds, traumatic injuries from car accidents and gang violence. Elena taught me that the principles of trauma surgery don't change whether you're in a hospital or a warehouse. The human body is the same everywhere. Commander Harrison made notes as she spoke, but his expression remained neutral and professional. What happened to Dr. Vasquez? Maria's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. She was killed treating a gang member who had been shot by a rival group. His friends decided she was taking too long to save him, that maybe she was letting him die on purpose. They shot her while she was working on him. The room was quiet for a long moment. Maria stared at her hands, remembering the night she had found Elena's body in the clinic, remembering the decision to disappear from Los Angeles before the same violence claimed her. Is that when you decided to join the Navy? Captain Walsh asked. I couldn't stay in LA after Elena died, Maria said. The gangs knew who I was, knew that I had medical skills they could exploit. It was either join the military or become their permanent medical staff. The choice was easy. Captain Walsh closed the file folder and leaned back in her chair. Maria, what you've told us explains a great deal about your abilities and your performance in the field. It also raises questions about how the Navy can best utilize your skills. I want to stay with my team, Maria said quickly. They trust me and I trust them. We work well together. I understand that, Walsh replied. But your surgical abilities are extraordinary. Have you considered that you might serve more people by pursuing advanced medical training? The Navy would support your education if you wanted to become a physician. It was the same suggestion Dr. Chen had made, the same opportunity that had once seemed impossible. But now, with her background exposed and her skills recognized, it might actually be within reach. I've thought about it, Maria admitted, but I'm not sure I belong in a regular hospital. My training was unconventional. Commander Harrison smiled for the first time during the interview. Maria, unconventional training isn't necessarily a disadvantage. Some of the best military physicians I know learned their skills in field conditions that taught them things no medical school could provide. Captain Walsh nodded in agreement. What matters is results. You've proven that you can save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Whether you learned those skills in a medical school or a warehouse in Los Angeles doesn't change their value. The panel concluded their questions, and Maria was dismissed while they deliberated about her future. As she walked back to her quarters, she felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The secret she had carried for years was finally out, but she didn't yet know what consequences that revelation would bring. What she did know was that 3 of her teammates were alive because of skills learned in the shadows of East Los Angeles. Whatever happened next, that fact would never change. Elena Vasquez's legacy lived on in every life Maria saved, every technique she employed, every impossible situation she refused to accept as hopeless. The girl who had learned surgery in abandoned buildings had become a woman who could save lives anywhere, under any conditions. Now it was time to discover what the future held for someone who had finally stopped running from her past. The formal inquiry began 3 days after the IED attack. Maria sat across from a panel of Navy medical officers, psychiatrists, and intelligence personnel in a sterile conference room at the base hospital. Her teammates were recovering well. Rodriguez had been evacuated to Germany for specialized neurological care. Parker was stable but would need additional surgery, and Mitchell was already demanding to be released back to duty. Captain Rebecca Walsh, the senior medical officer conducting the inquiry, opened a thick file folder and spread several documents across the table. Maria recognized copies of her military service record, medical training certifications, and performance evaluations. What she didn't recognize were several additional documents that hadn't been there before. Petty Officer Santos, you understand this is a standard inquiry following any field medical incident involving unusual procedures. Captain Walsh began, her tone professional but not unfriendly. Your actions saved 3 lives, And the Navy wants to understand how and why you were able to perform advanced surgical techniques under combat conditions. Maria nodded, keeping her expression neutral despite the anxiety building in her chest. According to witness statements, you performed what appears to be a field craniotomy on Petty Officer Rodriguez. Walsh continued, reading from a report. This is a neurosurgical procedure typically performed only by specialists in hospital settings. Can you explain how you learned this technique? The question Maria had been dreading was finally on the table. She had rehearsed various answers during the past 3 days, but none of them felt adequate. Half-truths and deflections had worked with her teammates, but they wouldn't satisfy a formal investigation. Emergency situations require improvisation, Maria said carefully. I use techniques adapted from my medical training to address the specific injuries I encountered. Commander James Harrison, the psychiatrist on the panel, leaned forward slightly. Maria, your psychological evaluations have always been exemplary. You show remarkable stress tolerance and decision-making abilities under pressure, but the procedures you performed go beyond improvisation. They demonstrate surgical knowledge and experience that isn't reflected in your official training record. Maria felt the walls closing in around her. These people were professionals who understood medicine and human behavior. They wouldn't be satisfied with vague explanations or deflections. Captain Walsh opened another document, and Maria's heart rate spiked as she recognized what it was. A background investigation report that was much more detailed than anything she had seen before. Maria, we've conducted an expanded background investigation as part of this inquiry, Walsh said gently. We know about Los Angeles. We know about the clinics. We know about Dr. Elena Vasquez. The mention of Elena's name hit Maria like a physical blow. Dr. Elena Vasquez had been her mentor, teacher, and surrogate mother during the years when Maria had learned to save lives in the shadows of East LA. Elena had taught her surgery in abandoned buildings, had shown her how to treat trauma without proper equipment, had given her the skills that were now saving American soldiers' lives. Elena had also been killed 3 years ago, murdered by the same gang member she had spent her life trying to help. We're not here to judge your past, Commander Harrison said, his voice gentle. We're here to understand how your experiences shaped your abilities, and how those abilities can best serve the Navy and your teammates. Maria looked around the table at the faces watching her, seeing not the condemnation she had expected, but something that looked like compassion and professional curiosity. For the first time in years, she found herself considering the possibility of telling the truth. Dr. Vasquez was a trauma surgeon, Maria said quietly, her voice barely above a whisper. She lost her license after a malpractice lawsuit, but she kept practicing in underground clinics. She treated people who couldn't go to hospitals, undocumented immigrants, gang members, anyone who needed help but couldn't risk official medical care. Captain Walsh nodded encouragingly. And she taught you? Starting when I was 14, Maria continued, the words coming easier now that she had started. At first I just helped with basic care, holding pressure on wounds, organizing supplies, translating for patients who only spoke Spanish. But Elena saw that I had natural aptitude, and she started teaching me more advanced techniques. The memories flooded back as she spoke, countless nights spent in makeshift operating rooms, learning anatomy from textbooks Elena had saved from medical school, practicing surgical procedures on cadavers obtained through connections Maria had never questioned. It had been an education in medicine that no university could have provided, brutal and comprehensive and entirely outside the bounds of conventional training. By the time I was 18, I was performing surgery, Maria continued. Gunshot wounds, stab wounds, traumatic injuries from car accidents and gang violence. Elena taught me that the principles of trauma surgery don't change whether you're in a hospital or a warehouse. The human body is the same everywhere. Commander Harrison made notes as she spoke, but his expression remained neutral and professional. What happened to Dr. Vasquez? Maria's hands clenched involuntarily in her lap. She was killed treating a gang member who had been shot by a rival group. His friends decided she was taking too long to save him, that maybe she was letting him die on purpose. They shot her while she was working on him. The room was quiet for a long moment. Maria stared at her hands, remembering the night she had found Elena's body in the clinic, remembering the decision to disappear from Los Angeles before the same violence claimed her. Is that when you decided to join the Navy? Captain Walsh asked. I couldn't stay in LA after Elena died. Maria said. The gangs knew who I was, knew that I had medical skills they could exploit. It was either join the military or become their permanent medical staff. The choice was easy. Captain Walsh closed the file folder and leaned back in her chair. Maria, what you've told us explains a great deal about your abilities and your performance in the field. It also raises questions about how the Navy can best utilize your skills. I want to stay with my team, Maria said quickly. They trust me and I trust them. We work well together. I understand that, Walsh replied. But your surgical abilities are extraordinary. Have you considered that you might serve more people by pursuing advanced medical training? The Navy would support your education if you wanted to become a physician. It was the same suggestion Dr. Chen had made, the same opportunity that had once seemed impossible. But now, with her background exposed and her skills recognized, it might actually be within reach. I've thought about it, Maria admitted, but I'm not sure I belong in a regular hospital. My training was unconventional. Commander Harrison smiled for the first time during the interview. Maria, unconventional training isn't necessarily a disadvantage. Some of the best military physicians I know learned their skills in field conditions that taught them things no medical school could provide. Captain Walsh nodded in agreement. What matters is results. You've proven that you can save lives under the most challenging conditions imaginable. Whether you learned those skills in a medical school or a warehouse in Los Angeles doesn't change their value. The panel concluded their questions, and Maria was dismissed while they deliberated about her future. As she walked back to her quarters, she felt a strange mixture of relief and anxiety. The secret she had carried for years was finally out, but she didn't yet know what consequences that revelation would bring. What she did know was that 3 of her teammates were alive because of skills learned in the shadows of East Los Angeles. Whatever happened next, that fact would never change. Elena Vasquez's legacy lived on in every life Maria saved, every technique she employed, every impossible situation she refused to accept as hopeless. The girl who had learned surgery in abandoned buildings had become a woman who could save lives anywhere, under any conditions. Now it was time to discover what the future held for someone who had finally stopped running from her past.